on Know Your Rights, just some of the things that are helpful in any season to know, what rights and protections you have. What do you do when you're stopped by law enforcement? So we'd love to hear from him about all of that. And then internal legal counsel Tony Weigel will discuss a lot of the new developments, things that might be on the horizon related to international students, because there are still a lot of questions about what the future of international students in the United States is, and what some of the things that we have had for a long time, what those things might be changing. So we'll take a peek into the future and also address some things that are currently happening here. So that's what we're doing today. We'll send out the slides and notes and recording after this session if you wanted to just stay present and listen to the session, and then you can look at those notes later rather than having to write everything down. And with that, I will introduce Jacob Foor to take it over. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. As it was mentioned, my name is Jacob Foor, and I work in the law school legal clinic. I work with unaccompanied children who have entered this country, trying to help find them relief and protection. But I have a connection to this office because my wife worked here for a number of years, and I've worked a lot with international students as well. So care pretty deeply about y'all's experience here, and it's pretty close to my heart. And so, yeah, it's good you're getting these slides afterward because there's going to be a lot on them and you won't be able to read it all as I'm going through it. But I'm basically going to try to cover a few things. One is just the basis for some of your rights while you're here in the US, along with what those rights are, and some best practices you can follow, especially if you were to encounter law enforcement in some way, which hopefully you will not. But it's better to know in advance. And I'll share a lot of helpful resources that you can also review as well. And so just to start off, this is a very complicated graph that kind of shows how our immigration system works or should work. But at the very top, you can see the Constitution. And that's a lot about what we're going to be talking about today. So kind of the founding government document of the United States. And a lot of the protections that are in there that are mostly in there to protect individuals against kind of government action in different ways. When it was created, there was a lot of concern about that. And a lot of what we'll be drawing from here today is kind of coming from there. But there are a lot of other things that influence your time here. So some of those come from those three orange government branches. So whether that's Congress and some of the laws that our immigration law operates under, or whether it's from the executive branch, which is the president. And when it comes to immigration law, a lot of it is influenced by the executive branch as they kind of oversee the way the law is interpreted sometimes or enforced. And so from administration to administration, there's a lot of differences, which you might have noticed even in the last several months. And then there's the judicial branch, which are kind of the courts, which is where some folks will find themselves in, which are helping to ensure that our rights are protected as things are litigated. And so, again, yeah, the United States Constitution has some kind of, is like a framework for a lot of these protections. And I'm going to go over some of some specific ones that are going to pertain to you a lot more. And so you can see some of those up here, but we'll get into them in a little bit. But the good news is that every person in the United States, regardless of your immigration status, is protected by the Constitution and some of the rights that it entails. So that's good news for all of us. And while these rights are very broad, they also have limits. So I'll very briefly touch on some of the limits that you might run into, but broadly speaking, all of us, are kind of protected by these things. And you can see that in this little paragraph from the 14th Amendment, which talks about how, right, the government is not allowed to deprive any person of their life, their liberty, their property, with kind of like an equal process under the law, equal protection under the law. And so this is why we're protected because of things like this. So here are some of the big rights that you have that come from the Constitution. It's things like the protection of speech and your ability to express yourself while here. The Fourth and Fifth Amendment have a lot to do with protections from, and the Sixth for that matter too, with protections from the government interfering in your life in some way. So you might have heard kind of like the right to remain silent, to not be forced to share information that can be used against you. And that plays out in a lot of different ways. Like, for instance, you can't be forced to sign documents, relinquishing your rights. You have protections against the government, searching you, whether that's your person or whether that's your private residence. They can't just kind of come in and do whatever they want and then use that against you in the United States. Now, there's some kind of exceptions and ways where the government can't do these things, but overall, there's broad protections around them. And you also have a right to counsel. So if you ever were to need it, you do have a right to have an attorney, not necessarily paid for by the government, unless it's a criminal proceeding. But in immigration context, you have a right to an attorney who can help you to navigate some of the complexities of the law. And so I'll zoom in a little bit, just kind of as an example on the First Amendment, which is, again, our protections over our ability to express ourselves. I shared back in the spring when we went through this, I kind of like a lot of best practices. So like if you were to, for instance, go to like a demonstration or a protest, you're allowed to do that. But there's a lot of good ways to go about doing that. So for instance, like ensuring your safety, letting other people know where you are, understanding the laws and policies of the city, of the university, so you don't run afoul of them, listening to any law enforcement that might be present. Even though you can express yourself, there are limits within that. And if you are to violate any of those kind of things I just mentioned, right, it can very easily get you in trouble, with immigration officials and, potentially put some of your status in jeopardy. So the good news is you have this like broad right, but there's also these kind of things that you want to be aware of as you go about it. And even for things that are technically protected, like for instance, posting about your thoughts online while you're in this country, there's also some things just to have good wisdom about, because of course, when you put things online, whether it's your home countries can see that, or I know a lot of you have probably gone through much more intense vetting, even as you applied for visas to come to the United States. And a lot of that comes from the government looking at your social media. So again, right, there's the right is there, but there's also kind of limits to what that might look like. And here's some more kind of examples of, do's and don'ts that you can take a look at later. And you can notice some of the don'ts are kind of things that would be violating city laws or ordinances or things like that that can get you into trouble. Now, if you've been following the news, or you were in the spring, you probably heard about international students' visas being revoked. Even here at this university, I know that happened for a time with some people. And this overlaps a lot with what I was just talking about with like the First Amendment. So right, there's this broad right, yet nonetheless, international students were having visas revoked by the United States government. And there often wasn't a lot of explanation as to why that was happening, but over time some patterns emerged. And so some of those reasons were when students would go to campus protests and were advocating, especially around controversial issues, for instance, like the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. And the government was paying attention to some of those things. We noticed that in revoking visas in response to them, there run-ins with law enforcement, even for minor things like traffic tickets, let alone more major crimes, seem to be part of the pattern of why the government was coming in and taking those sorts of actions. In the past, a lot of these things had more protection, I would say. And you can see this is from one of the immigration laws. There are lots of different reasons the government is actually able to come in and reconsider immigration status and visas. And when it came to protests, you'll notice this bottom one, A4. There was kind of this wording about if security risks were at play or actions were being taken by international students in this case that were adverse to US policy. They're basically making this argument that when protesting for certain things, that was undercutting US security. So that's debatable. There's been lots of litigation around that, but you can see there's this tension of the US government sometimes using one law over here and it coming into tension with the rights you actually have. So I share this not to scare you or terrify you, but just to illustrate that this is complicated and that there are risks that you should be aware of, especially when you take some actions that could put yourself out there while you're here. Again, hopefully you never, ever, ever will have any kind of interactions with law enforcement or ICE or government officials in any sort of way. But if you do, I wanted to go over some of the best practices for that. So here's like a long list of some groups that might be a little more vulnerable given your status. And some of them are things people you might expect. So people that have been ordered deported or people that maybe don't have an immigration status that are in the United States. But you notice on the bottom, there's a couple of categories that would fit maybe your situation, student visas or some of those more activistic, those who are more activistically engaged. We've noticed there's been more attention by the government. So again, don't want to scare you or anything, but just be aware, that you want to be considerate in some of the things that you do because of this. So you might run into lots of law enforcement officials or see them around while you're here. And I put up some badges to help recognize who you're dealing with, because some of how you might engage with law enforcement might depend on who you're talking to. So for instance, the Fayetteville Police typically is dealing with local matters, issues here. Very different from immigration and custom enforcement or ICE, who's much more focused on enforcing immigration law. These are the people you often see in the news in masks, and it's a little scarier. And so knowing kind of these different groups, and you could look more into what they do, and it's up here obviously, can help you to know who you're talking to if you ever have to. So a lot of information here, but in general, I want to stress that the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, and to some extent the Sixth Amendment as well, are mostly the big protections you have that are going to protect you when you're dealing with law enforcement, if you ever are. There's some differences into what law enforcement can do if you're in like a public space, like you're walking on the university, versus if you're in an apartment off campus, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But in general, you have a lot of protections when you come into those encounters. And in general, law enforcement and ICE need to have things called either reasonable suspicion in some circumstances or probable cause to take more actions against you. And what that means is they basically have to have a reason that they think you're doing something wrong. The biggest ways that this happens is usually if we give them that information. So if you start getting peppered with questions and then you start sharing openly, in answering things, sometimes you can get information that way. Sometimes if someone came to visit your home and said, come on in, that could be a way that they gain access to information. And so in general, a lot of the key takeaways and our best practices are us choosing to not give that information, especially if we're feeling like we're in a situation where we're at risk. And not giving permission for law enforcement or immigration officials to kind of find the information they might be looking for to take actions that we might not want them to take. And as I mentioned, since you're protected under the Constitution, you can actually say no, at least in many circumstances, to allowing that to happen. And they are going to have to go a longer way to do the things they want to do. So here's some kind of do's and don'ts. Oops. So if you do ever encounter law enforcement, don't run, argue, resist, or like obstruct, what they're trying to do. So you want to try to be calm and to participate, but that doesn't mean you don't communicate your rights when you need to. Do not lie. So especially about your immigration status, doing that alone can get you into some serious issues when it comes to immigration authorities. Don't give long explanations or excuses, and generally tons of information that could later be used against you. You don't have to sign documents. You don't have to get permission for them to do things that they're not allowed to do. Don't discuss your citizenship or immigration status. For a lot of the ways that immigration officials can take actions against you that are negative, they have to first know that you're not a citizen of this country and that you're an international student, for instance. And so if we do not provide that information, it can often, at the very least, slow things down, and or even just stop the encounter entirely. So there's a little caveat to that I'll mention in a second, but that's maybe a general best practice. For those of you that drive, and I know some of you are getting driver's license, which is great. It is very, very helpful. Just being really mindful of how you navigate the roadways, which is good for safety, but especially because we saw some of these even minor infractions getting international students in trouble, it's even more important for you to be paying attention in that space. Do tell police your name, especially in Arkansas, you are required to give identification of who you are. But that does not mean, like I said, you have to tell your whole story or you have to tell I'm not a citizen here, I'm an immigrant. You don't have to do any of that other stuff, but you do need to identify yourself if you interact with police. Do tell police that I want to remain silent if they continue to ask you questions and you feel like uncomfortable in the situation you do not want to. Do tell them you want to talk to a lawyer because you are entitled to if you do, and they are supposed to stop questioning you at that point. Um, yeah, there's some other tips on kind of, and I'll get to this later if you happen to be arrested, so you can look at those for best practices. And there are also some tips on here for if police come to your house or to your apartment. I mentioned earlier that when you're in a private space like your home, you are protected from the government just charging in there. They have to have a reason to enter. And one of the big ways that they do that is they have to go to a judge and they have to show, hey, here are all the reasons we think we should be able to enter this person's home. And the judge has to look at it and agree and sign off on that. And if they do that process, which is protective of us, right? Then they have the ability to come into a home. And it would, I'll show it later, but it would be a search warrant or an arrest warrant that they would have to get. Often immigration officials or police do not want to go through that process. And if they come to your home, they will not have a warrant like that. And if that is the case, they are not allowed to enter and you can refuse. So you have that protection in your private space. And a lot of best practices are do not open the door. Do not like even crack it open, just keep it closed. You can talk through the door. If they want to slide a piece of paper under the doorway or through a crack in the window or something, that's okay. But you can call whether it's the university or whether it's an attorney at that point to get guidance on how to proceed from there. So again, I know this is all really scary, to hear that. So I don't think it's going to happen to y'all, but this, if it does, these are some things to remember. So again, I mentioned this earlier. I'm not going to go through it all again, but a lot of the reason I'm so stringent on like being quiet, asking for a lawyer, it comes from this. We do not want to give information that could get us into further trouble. And so we want to have that protective barrier before we do. So police and immigration officials are often be very creative if they're targeting you for some reason. They do not necessarily need to tell the truth. They can try to get around this in different ways. And so it's very important for us to be clear about that we are asserting our rights. So where are you from? Where were you born? What's your nationality? You see the answer is always the same. I'd like to remain silent. I do not want to answer that question. I'd like to speak to my lawyer, these kinds of things. All right, some things that can be helpful. You see up here, it says a red card. There's a resource on here that it's basically a little card that has all of these rights on there. Because sometimes it can be scary. Like when I get stopped like if I'm driving and if a police officer stops me, like I'm nervous when that happens. And I could only imagine if you met someone on the roadway or you met someone at your home. Sometimes it's helpful to have a little card that communicates these things clearly. You don't have to remember it all your head. It's important to have forms of identification. Obviously, if you're driving, a driver's license, but other identification that can help to show who you are to officials. It can be helpful if you have documents that show that you are lawfully here. And again, it's a little bit of like a tension between you don't want to communicate if you're not a citizen of this country, but at the same time, in some situations, showing that you have legal status can actually really help move things along. So it's kind of a call for you to make. But if those documents do not show you're a citizen of another country, just that you have legal status here, then generally those are safe to carry. Copies, not your original. And also having on you just, important contexts that you would like to communicate with if you're in a situation where you don't know what to do. Okay, so we're getting closer to the end of my time. And some of these things you'll notice they repeat. So I already mentioned a lot of these things about if you were to encounter police or immigration officials at your home. So you can kind of go through these, but again, silent, keeping the door shut, calling for help, those sorts of things can really help you to be protected in those situations. These are images of warrants. So I mentioned this is a search warrant. So this would allow police to come into your home. Down here, it would need to be signed by a judge. So if you really want to study it and you want to know what it looks like, you can take a look at this. I believe this is an arrest warrant to allow them to come in and to arrest you in your home. Again, down here would be signed by a judge. That's the important part. Often though, immigration officials are gonna have something that looks more like this, which is kind of something they sign in their office, basically. So it does allow them to do certain things, but it does not allow them to do a lot of other things that you have protections around. And so the signature is going to be different. It's going to be like an immigration officer. So that's a little bit how you can tell a difference. But if in doubt, follow some of the other advice I was telling you. So, all right. Yeah, a lot of the advice, again, I'm just reiterating it over and over. If you're walking around campus and you encounter ICE or encounter police, which we have not heard reports of increased ICE activity on this campus or anything, so it's not up here for that reason. But if that were to happen, again, remaining silent. And one thing that could be helpful is to ask, am I free to go? Because similar to these other things, police are not allowed to hold you against your will unless they have a reason to. And if they don't have a reason to, maybe they just are looking at you and they decide to stop you, but they don't really have a reason beyond that, they are not allowed to keep you there. And so asking questions like, am I free to go, is a question that communicates to the officer, oh, am I detained? Are you arresting me? And it should be something to them that says, no, 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 you're free to move on. So saying, I don't want to talk, am I free to go? Again, not signing anything, and some of these other things can help you sometimes to get out of situations before they may be escalated to something you don't want. Let's skip over this one for now, it's less important. I mentioned some of these things as well, but if you do happen to be arrested, it's very important that you immediately say, I would like to assert my right to an attorney. I would like to have my attorney present. The police should cease questioning you at that point, and you can wait for someone who can help you. And I've mentioned remaining silent. If you are arrested, many people have a right to go through a court process. So they can't just take you and send you home or something like that. You have a right to tell your story and to work through things, and again, to have a lawyer present in that. And since you should have a valid documented visa as students, that would include you. You have that right. So you don't need to be kind of fearful of that. And many people as well have a right to be released after they are detained while they kind of figure all these things out. So we don't need to worry about that now, but just so you know. And I think this is my last slide, just before resources, but memorize this language or get those cards. And again, we'll send these slides out so you'll have them. But these are the sort of things that you want to use the magic language, because sometimes it can be easy for police or immigration officials to say, well, they kind of said this, but I didn't really know what they meant. And so I kind of kept doing it anyway. And there have been whole court cases about this. And so being very, very clear and using the magic words helps people to know that you want these protections applied to you. So Tony's going to come up here and share a little bit more. My sticker or my clicker's working anymore. Is going to come up and share a little bit more about updates on kind of the nature of things. But you can see on here, I have several pages of resources that will help you to learn more as well, because I know this is a lot. So thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry.
Are you?
Hey.
Which way
Is
is
it
it?
working?
Okay,
Mhm.
I'll back up. To me, okay, that's both. I'm Tony Weigel. I'm the Associate General Counsel and Office of General Counsel for the university. I'm a system employee. I do work for Fayetteville and then also for some of the other campuses in the system. I mainly work with sponsorship and compliance and just issues that come up. Been doing this for a while. Just really quickly on the disclosure, this is standard language. When we have Q&A, if you have any questions, I can respond to general questions. But what we want to do is keep a simple outline. I'm just going to go through just the life cycles, typical life cycle of an F and a J, F1 and J1. And then the summary of kind of really the administrative and regulatory action that's taken place since January. is going to follow that timeline. And then just talk about some of the, and how this applies to everybody. To kind of done the last presentation of some of this information. Mainly, we'll be talking about, sorry, that's the wrong way. The area of activity has been in both policy and executive action. There has been some activity in the regulatory space. There are some legislative proposals that we'll talk about in a little bit. And there's one really important constitutional issue. And then, and as well, you know, this is a little bit repetitive, but, you know, the executive branch administers the law. The second point, though, for old people, back in the day, there was something just called INS, for Immigration Naturalization Service. And for in the immigration rule, they did the benefits, they did admissions into the country, they did enforcement. And after 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security was created, and Department of Homeland Security is the umbrella organization, and ICE, Customs and Border Protection, and USAS fall underneath that. And for a while, they were separate. Over time, they kind of went into each other's space a little bit, but more in a complementary manner. But now there's really kind of a free-for-all in terms of which agency is doing what. They're all kind of, it's really kind of like DHS is now old INS, is a kind of one way to think about it. With regard to the courts, there's a lot of news stories about cases in the news. U.S. Supreme Court's the highest court, and you know, so it's we'll talk about that in a minute. But for F1s, you know, this is kind of the typical cycle. You know, either enter or change to F1. A lot of people work on campus. You know, there's some people that, you know, they can possibly work outside of campus pre-graduation. For you have the 12-month OPT for all majors. And then for certain degree programs, there's the additional 24 months. And usually that's when I start interacting with people, is once they're working or looking for jobs and making that transition from OPT to H-1B. And then, like in the last points, you know, people, if they want to stay in the country, they'll look at options to get permanent status, a lot of times through employment, sometimes through a family basis. But that's, did I do that or did you do that?
My mistake. That was sorry.
So that's the F1, kind of just the cycle. J1 is very similar in that, you know, the thing about J's, there's several different categories, and the focus is really just on the students. You know, when they complete, you have the academic training, work authorization. The 2-year home residence requirement became a lot better after there were some updates on the skills list. So there's a couple of different ways people can have to go home if they're on a J. So that's usually the main transition issue. And then also 2 J's will normally look at, you know, a lot of times J's will go to H and then into green card status. But this is kind of laying out that part of it. So in terms of the work, the presentation flow, we're going to start on the admission and entry. And I look back at my presentation from January and February, and there's been a lot of activity. This one, though, the administrative processing has always been there. And a lot of times, for example, Pakistan was a country that had a lot of administrative processing, but if people had a technical background, the more higher tech, they would have administrative processing. It's been out there, but it's become more focused. There's a particular form that's linked here because the Department of State, the consular officers can ask a lot of information going way back, you know, where you've been employed, you know, where you've worked. And that can be like, I guess the main takeaway is that administrative processing can be a few weeks, it can be a few months, it can be several months that a person can get stuck outside the US waiting for a decision. And I think it was NASA conference last in 2024, they said that 12 months was like, you know, like a, you know, if you were stuck more than 12 months, then they would look at it. So, but on these 2 things here, with regard to the, you know, people who entered or needed a visa stamp to re-enter, there was a period of time where it was paused, mainly so that the Department of State can implement some social media screening. That resumed, but it's like a traffic jam, kind of back things up. So we've got that, and the other thing, it's only happened a couple of times. And I want to just make mention of it. There for about 2 or 3 days, the country of Colombia had its visa processing shut down. And then around May, there were a lot of news stories about Chinese students either not only being not admitted, but then not being able to continue to stay. And the main takeaway there is that these visas are being intermingled with other things such as trade policy or some other foreign relations policy. So, look for that to continue. So, everything's good. It's just, and that's one of the things too. There's a lot of things that people write about because they want you to click on their story. And so anyway, so we got that. See where we're at country specific. And then June, we got the one that we were expecting, which was what they're looking at is a travel ban, and no, next one. Okay. Okay. Was the travel restrictions, and so there were a total of 19 countries, and the main takeaway here is that a lot of these countries were on the first Trump administration's travel bans. They did make an exception for people with valid FRJ visa stamps. The thing is, those visa stamps do expire. And a lot of times for those countries, they had a very short stamping period. But it did provide a little bit of transition relief. U.S. permanent residents, dual citizens are exempt, but and there's supposed to be a national interest type exception, but I don't think there's been a lot of movement there. So where are we going next? Visa bonds. This has been something that's been in the law for a long time. And they've come up for specifically the B1 and B2 visitors, which are visitors which you can think, oh, if you're from one of these countries and your parents want to come see you graduate, they'll pay money and you can get it back if you don't overstay the visa or don't use the visa stamp. But if somebody comes in and they change status to another status, then they're out the money. So, and it could be, like I said, it's a small number of countries now. They did update it. They did an initial list in August. They added a couple of countries in October. So this is really more like people traveling to come visit. And then, hopefully if they're coming as a dependent, they're going to come as a dependent initially and avoid this. So we're at now. So September, the Department of State announced that you can only process in your home country or country of residence. So for example, somebody did a master's degree in Germany, they're resident in Germany, so they can process in Germany. But if they're born in India, so they have 2 options, India or Germany. But if they are only in India, they're going to process in India. And India is taking about 3 months for visa stamp appointments right now. And it can really, it impacts the initial entry, but also to the travel entries in between when visa stamps expire. And then the other change, and this was an early change, was that they moved, there was a period of time where if a person had a previously issued visa, they would still have to apply for the visa stamp to enter, but they basically took the time, made it much more narrow. It has to be the same type of visa and it has to be less than 12 months since the expiration. So that's impacted the workflow at the consulates and embassies and kind of extended things. So again, a lot of these are just kind of small things, but they can be impactful. I've had the discussion about the CBIS terminations. And this was really just kind of taking AI and matching the National Criminal Database against CBIS and making decisions without notice or due process. There were hundreds of people filed lawsuits, and the government has, to my understanding, restored a high percentage of those folks. But a lot of the attorneys are advising F1s that were impacted by this to be careful on travel. Possibly wait till you change to another status, down the road, because travel can be a risk. But again, people should consult their own counsel if they were affected. The ISS office did a really complete information on this. And this is, again, in the law, a pre-existing law, there was this requirement for people to register with the government, kind of who you are, where you're staying. For people who get a 994 and they come in, they're taken care of. The main issue was for people, if you had a child that came in at the age of 12 and now they're 15, they would be required to file paperwork, but this registration requirement is popped up, and there are civil and criminal penalties for failure to comply. The one group of people that are weirdly affected are Canadians. They have to request a 994 when they come in. I think they have to pay an extra $6 or whatever, but some Canadians just go back and forth. But in order to register, they actually either have to pay for the I-94 or register within 30 days of coming in. So Canadians have a special burden. So this is something I was going to ask Sarah to talk about a little bit after I cover these 2 or 3 points. So in the US, whenever there's a regulatory change, the agency is supposed to publish a notice that they want to change the law. And according to the law, they have to allow time for the public to comment. And then it can be 3 months, it can be 6 months, it can be 9 months, a year, 2 years later, they might actually issue a regulation. And in this case, it impacts the duration of status that's afforded to F1s and J1s. And the main reason that they have that is because they're tracked in status. So they have a record. But you know, there's a proposed regulation, the comments have closed, and we don't know how long it's going to take. You know, one of the impacts is that, you know, a person will come in and there would be a maximum of 4 years. And if they want to stay longer, they have to file with the government. And there's also some other things regarding changes of programs. So if you want to just talk for a couple minutes about this, because it may.
Sure. Yeah, happy to talk about this. And one thing that I'll say on the front end is that we know what the proposal says, but we don't know what the final rule will say. And so right now, I can tell you a bit of a summary on what we think the implications will be, but when they actually come out, whether it's in a few months or a few years, or, you know, there's a slight possibility that it disappears, but we'll see.
Or
what the future
litigation
holds.
after it's finalized, you think it's going to have a life.
Right, so all of this is a bit speculative, but has the proposal piece is what I'll be sharing with you. So right now, your duration of status means that you, as long as you're in the US with a valid I-20 or a valid DS-2019, then you have status in the US, even if your visa has expired, even if you need an extension on your documents. Many of you maybe came for an undergraduate degree, transferred to a grad program at the master's level, did OPT, came back for a PhD. All of that is within the life cycle of your duration of status. What this proposal would do, if implemented the way that it was written, at each point in time where you might need an I-20 extension, you might transfer to a new institution, you might start a new program level. At each of those points, you would actually file not just with ISS on that, but you would file with the US government, which would include an application, probably the I-539, and a fee, probably around $500, give or take. So that would be a big change in just the freedom of movement, you know, changing your program, having, you know, changing degree level after you graduate. It would also, part of the proposal is to limit the ability for grad students in particular to transfer to other programs. Transferring within a certain time period of entering the US, so needing to be in your program for a year before you change to a new program, even at the undergraduate level. And then other things, shortening the grace period. Right now there's a 60-day grace period after you finish your program on the F side, and this would limit it to 30 days, matching the J1 side, which already is 30 days. But that would be a pretty big change in the timeline of making your next steps after you finish your degree. Those are some of the major impacts that we would see coming out of this. final rule if things aren't addressed or again litigated through the courts. But we will see what the future holds, and as soon as a final rule were to come out, we'll be reading that very thoroughly and updating you on what that change would bring to you in particular, and what the process would be for you to still hopefully achieve your goals, but maybe with a few more obstacles along the way that we would try to help you navigate as much as we can.
Okay. Yeah, so this next one is, thank you, the next one. So back when we started, this is the same slide. The executive branch, they issued an order. And so what's happened since then is that there have been court decisions at the entry level that have gone up, and the Supreme Court said that pushed it back down, but now it's expected that this proposal will go back up to the Supreme Court between October of 25 and June of 26, and this is going to be in the news. Specifically, if a mother was unlawfully present and the father's not a citizen or permanent resident, according to this executive order, the child would not automatically be a U.S. citizen. But the second part is really the one is the mother is in the U.S. lawfully, but in a temporary status, and the father's not a citizen or permanent resident, that the child wouldn't be considered a U.S. citizen. So, there's court cases that have gone back 140 years that, a lot of people, when you read about this, they'll say this is settled law and that this is really an aggressive legal argument. So we'll wait and see. But like I said, it's, we'll find out in the next 9 months. So, yeah, so this is really kind of where I've been spending, this next slide's where I've been spending a lot of my time on what's happening, because most people are looking at graduating and moving to OPT or moving from OPT to H1. On September 19th, the administration issued a proclamation saying that in certain instances, a $100,000 fee would be required to, or an exception to the fee would be required to obtain an H-1B for people who are outside the U.S. or would have to process outside the U.S. But this $100,000 fee could also apply to people who are in the U.S. So if you have, like I've got a request for evidence on my desk for somebody that the USCIS is questioning whether or not they've maintained their status. I think they have too many days of unemployment when the person was a student. So clearly they've made a mistake, but we'll get it cleared up. But that's one of the cases where that may come up as the Immigration Service adjudicates a petition. So we're working internally on that. I've been here a lot of hours for that. And that's in process as far as the institution goes. And there's also too, it's a challenge right now because I saw in the news, like some Walmart said they would discontinue sponsor or put a pause on H-1B sponsorship. So there's a number of companies that are trying to process all that, figure out how to work with it. Regulatory action. There's a rule that's proposed, and that I think it just closed. The comments on it is that the government only has 85,000 new visas for the for-profit companies where people are graduating out and trying to get one of those slots. It would prioritize it by the highest wage level. So it's going to make it harder for entry-level folks to get in the game. And there's some other things. There's a kind of an isolated bill in the House and Senate that would look at taking away the cap exemption for universities and affiliated nonprofits. There's a bill that's got bipartisan support that would make significant changes to the H-1B program. And then there's just a whole host of others on the spectrum. But all these things, like from our perspective, we're monitoring and making sure that we're working with all these. But I've worked with people changing to H-1B for over 20 years, and every year people have the same concern. Well, I make the quota. It's not just making the quota. It's kind of there's a lot of the things in play right now that. Again, these are the proclamation is real. It's in place, and we're trying to figure out how it's going to be implemented. But these other things, the proposed regulation, the expectation is that will be in place before the next, before February of 26. But some of these other things, it's really going to depend on if they move or not. But these are, again, the repeat of the slides, just, the it's important to know, like, if you're F1 or J1, or as the institution has an F1 or J1 sponsor, that, you know, there's obligations for us to do things, but also for you all that you've signed on for. And just to kind of keep doing those things. I mean, everything is tracked. Optional practical training, if a person changes employers, you know, all those things need to be made sure that they're maintain that training plan, because they can come on site and ask questions of, you know, you're working for this company, this job with these duties. So that 983 training plan is really important. And by signing that plan, you give consent to be investigated, so to speak, or to be reviewed. And then, you know, as far as faculty and staff go, if we have any of those folks, just, you know, I do provide information about, you know, checking your I-94, you know, making sure that if there are going to be any changes in your job and work location, to reach out to make sure that those things are taken care of in a timely manner, especially with the $100,000 fee issue that's out there. Also, too, whenever we sign petitions, we also grant consent to the government to ask questions of the individual and the employer about the job. So those are some special instances. And, you know, the other thing too, a lot of times, you know, strictly from the employer side, we don't think about the dependents. You know, dependents need to make sure that they're doing everything they're supposed to do. And right, I changed this last point though, because there are, you know, if you have any international travel, like I said, with all the things we talked about, visa processing, different things, you have to look at that and see, okay, are we going to be able to process visas, get back in time for school, or resume work as a faculty member or whatever. So that's what I've got.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.
We had a couple questions come in on the chat. So the first one is regarding the proposed duration of status elimination. Would the proposal affect a transfer after graduation? Let's say a student finishes their master's and wants to transfer to a PhD. Does it affect someone in that situation? And
Yeah,
I,
it would. Yeah,
yeah,
it would. That's exactly what it would change.
Yeah.
And just to be clarify on that 539 application, there's I think it's a $470 fee for the principal, but then there's, I think it's $370 for, it covers the family members.
Yeah.
So, and that's, we have to make sure that those folks are picked up as well.
Great point.
Okay, and thank you. And then one more question in regards to the STEM OPT extension, the 180-day work authorization extension. Someone asking if that is still in effect. And I don't know, Tony, if you'd had a chance to look at that, that came out yesterday or today, or Sarah, if either of you want to address that.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I hadn't thought of it, but I can tell you this, that because I had to look at it for other folks. So what happened was, as the government said, effective today, any applications filed for EAD extensions. So somebody, if they've applied for a green card and they have a work card, or they're H4 EAD and they've applied for a new work card, the government, as a matter of discretion, said, because we're taking so long to process these applications, we're going to take that expired EAD and receipt notice as evidence of this status. The thing is that, and I'll double check this, the STEM OPT is regulatory. So it doesn't fall within that category of discretionary extensions based on receipt.
Okay. So the understanding is that 180-day extension will still continue.
Correct.
Thank you. Any live questions or?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I want to clarify just one thing, or maybe just restate, because I know you said it, but the impact of the headline, $100,000 H-1B fee, I know is really alarming. And as it has been clarified, and there've been examples of how this is playing out, that fee is only for consular processed H-1B. So if you have a change of status from within the US, from F1 to H-1B, that is approved, you've been maintaining your F1 status, and now you're applying for H-1B, that $100,000 fee does not apply.
Yeah.
However, yeah, and there's a trapdoor, as Tony would say, and a lot of caveats, which is why I wanted to clarify, because there are a lot of caveats. But if they found you to have violated F1 status, then they could say, okay, we maybe approve this in theory, but you need to go get consular processed. which would then trigger the $100,000 fee. So as always, it's so important to maintain your F1 status or your J1 status. Always, right? But this is another layer of potential consequence. If there has been a violation of status along the way, they could put you in the path of having to pay the $100,000 H-1B fee, which is paid by the company, correct? Not
Yeah, the employer has to pay and, yeah.
So just wanted to clarify the change of status process does not have the $100,000 fee, but they could easily, I say easily, I don't know how easily, but they could put you on the category of having. to pay.
Yeah, and technically what it is, it's eligibility for a request. So every H-1B petition has two parts of request. First part is just for the employer to have the authorization to employ somebody in a job at a certain location. The second part of the request has to do with the person. It can be notify this consul if they're going to apply for a stamp and come in, or change their status, extend their status, amend their status. And the thing is that all the grounds of ineligibility, inadmissibility come up. So if there's criminal, national security, work authorization, anything like that can trigger, if you trigger any ground of inadmissibility, you can't change or extend. And people are getting our requests for evidence asking for either the fee or the national interest exception. And that's there's this learning curve that they're learning as they're going and we're learning as they're going. So, but I think that it is, it's challenging for both new hires, because I'm working on this, retaining people, because if you have somebody who's extending status and they don't get that requested extension of status, what do you do? And then for people who are changing status, okay, and that's where I'm talking to people that they have 18 months left of time on their STEM OPT, but they're like, everyone wanted out of the F1 boat because of all the activity with the F1 revocations. Now they want to be an H-1B. And I said, we still have 18 months left. And this proclamation runs until September of 26. And I'm operating the assumption it's going to be extended. If it's not shut there. And there are two federal court cases as well. U.S. Chamber and Association of American Universities are asking for relief. But because the U.S. Supreme Court decided that it can't be a national injunction, it's only those parties that filed suit. So it's a weird time right now. But I'm glad you brought that up.
Any other questions in the final 2 minutes, either in the audience or virtually? Any further questions? Tony or Jacob?
So if over the course of the F1 stay, if you never leave the United States and if you never try to leave and come back or something like that, does it affect anything? Like maybe transitioning to a different status or something.
And then that what goes back to what Sarah was talking about, making sure that you work with the ISS office, making sure that you maintain full course load, that if you're working, that it's authorized, just doing all those things and making sure you're doing all your updates and activities. That's because they will look back. And that's the unfortunate thing about USCIS. They're not state, they're not SEVP and ICE. It's like me going in and trying to teach a math class. They don't understand a lot of the nuances of the student and exchange visitor space. So that's part of the reason why the whole DS is just let your kid drive you to work. It's like he's 10. It's kind of a crazy proposal.
But yeah, as long as you have valid F1 status, I'm assuming F1, you can remain in the United States. Yeah.
Tony, do you see suspicion of non-immigrant intent being raised at the point of an I-539 application to extend status?
That's a good question. Because for a long time we saw, like for example, people from India, there's a long line of employment-based green cards for India. So, or even to a certain degree, China, and that the possibility of transitioning to a permanent status is so, it's not necessarily remote, but it's so far out there that for the period you're requesting on that 539, it's not an issue. It's always an issue when you travel. So like, for example, if you have an F1 with an approved I-140 national interest waiver petition, it's self-petition. Travels, immigrant intent is you have a record of it. So I'm kind of concerned, would be concerned in that area. And the thing is, immigration, when they process the petition, regardless of what you put in the paperwork, they're gonna pull it up and see it. So it's really gonna be, there's people, when they file the I-140s, there's two different ways you can file them. There's a box you can check and say, this is where the art form is a little bit. You can check the box, say, I'm gonna stay in the US and adjust my status to permanent resident, or you can check the box, I'm going to apply for consular visa processing, meaning I might intend to go out and come back in. And if somebody, so that's something that, it's really important for the person to work with the lawyer to make sure that they understand the impact of that and kind of how it goes. But there are ways, like, for example, Canadians, a lot of times Canadians who are sponsored for employment green cards, they'll list that they're going to process in Canada. And that's their intent at the time they file the paperwork. So that's one way to kind of work with it, but it is a risk.
Go ahead.
If I'm in a PhD program, I am to do another master at the same time.
So she asked if she's in a PhD program and wants to do a master's alongside the PhD. So that's something that the proposal does say, that you can't come down a level on your I-20. So if you finish a PhD, you wouldn't be able to go down to a master's as your primary. I don't believe that specific scenario was addressed in the proposal. Like you're still at the PhD level and picking up a master's along the way. I don't think that was addressed. Do you remember, Amy?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Correct, yeah.
Which is pretty common, and so I'm sure that if the proposal becomes finalized, we'll receive some guidance about how to help that situation, what to do in that case.
I mentioned, if I finish a PhD, I cannot go down to pursue another master.
So that is what the proposal does say, is that you can't go down in your levels.
But it's a different discipline. I still cannot.
That was part of what the proposal was to address. We really don't know, and we don't know if it is approved. We don't know what the final approval will look like, what the final regulation will be. So it could be, that 80% of it is exactly the same, but there's 20% that's different that they addressed through the public comment period, or we just don't know. But there is a possibility that what we see in the proposal doesn't become exactly reality.
So that leads me to, like, that just may triggered something, because there's every now and then you'll see discussion on optional practical training. The current USAS director, and there's political talk basically at this point about, the belief that OPT is not even valid as a matter of law. The thing is, OPT is in the regulation and would require regulatory action. And there's some, discussion, legislative wise, but if you see that, just understand that right now at this point, it's a political discussion. It's not actual legal regulatory action at this point. And if it is, we'll make sure that we, alert everybody. But that's one of the things, that there's a lot of newspapers, online newspapers out of India, that they are the first ones on any immigration headline. And a lot of times it's pretty good. The reporting's pretty good, but sometimes the cake's not baked yet, and people jump the gun, and it causes a lot of, I just read this, and it's like, yeah, you did. I read it too, same time. So.
Okay,
I have another question.
okay, yeah.
Okay.
Um,
So I remember, sorry. So you mentioned there's some risk for internationals to travel like out of the country to come back, right? Even with valid documentation and signature, not nowadays?
Anytime you leave and you're subject to, if you have to get a visa stamp, it's a discretionary decision to issue the visa stamp. And similarly, when you show up at the airport, the Customs and Border Protection has to admit you. So there's two levels of decision a lot of times, or even if you have a valid visa stamp, you'll still be readmitted. But that's one of the things that's best to talk. But my point with that was to make sure that you have all your documents in order, that there's not anything that's concerning. There's, and also too, the processing times, just can it put you out of time? But like I said, it's really going to depend on the person. But once it's always been, forever, it's a risk if you even come back. And it's good to talk to colleagues, for example, or other people who process maybe at the same post, or, if you're in the similar degree program. So there's a lot of information out there to make an informed decision. But I'll obviously also check with the ISS office and make sure that, you find lots of people travel every day. It's just to be vigilant, because one of the things that happened with the 100,000 proclamation, it was crazy. I was on the phone with a Canadian professional. I said, he was in Vancouver. I said, get your family and get back in your car before like this time. And there were people who were told to, the airlines were told not to board people with visas. So there were airplanes in like San Francisco that, they're trying to get people off of planes, and companies were trying to contact people. So there can be these really chaotic moments. If you're a straight F1 in your degree program, maintaining status, it's probably not going to impact. There's probably not going to be anything that's major, but there's a pattern of some really immediate action and kind of chaotic initial responses. But just do your homework in advance, talk to the ISS office, and but for the most part, I think summer travel is probably feasible for most people. The winter travel, depending upon if you have to apply for a visa stamp and the wait times, it might just be more of a logistical timing question. So just something to consider. But
And I,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
when students ask us, should I travel? Our first question is your visa valid? If your visa is still valid to return, most likely, we don't usually see issue at the port of entry. Now, there are some chaotic moments, and it is up to the discretion of the Customs and Border Protection officer. But for the majority of cases, vast majority, if you have a valid visa to leave and return, is not usually an issue. The risk comes when your visa has expired and you're needing to renew your visa before returning. And that's where there could be a no on that, right? You could be denied your visa renewal, or you could have a long delay in the approval process, which would then potentially disrupt your plans for return. So those are the kind of levels of risk that we would talk you through when asking about leaving the US to return. Great. Well, we thank our guests today, and thank you, participating online and everyone who came in person, and we'll send out the recording of the slide deck so you can read through all the good information that especially Jacob provided that didn't get mentioned out loud, but is still really valuable. And thank you again, Tony, for all that you do for us.
Thank you.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you both.